Montana Territory, September 1881. The wind carried the scent of pine and ash across the dry hills when Trace Bowman lowered to his knees before the stone marker and ran a hand across the carved name. The grass around the grave was still damp with morning dew, but he did not seem to notice. His hat sat beside him in the dirt, and he looked like a man who had not moved in hours. Claire Bowman, beloved wife, mother of two. Trace's fingers trembled as he set a small bunch of wildflowers at the base of the headstone yellow prairie sunflowers, the only thing still blooming this far into the season. His jaw clenched and his eyes burned, but no tears came. Not today. Not anymore. Behind him, the twin oak trees rustled, the only sound in the small cemetery just outside of Livingston. The town was 3 miles east, but Trace had not stepped foot in it for weeks. He had not needed to not since he buried Claire beside the same fence post where she used to watch the sun fall behind the mountains. The grave beside Claire's held 2 smaller markers. One read Zadie, age 6. The other, Zane, age 6. His twins, his babies. Lost to fever just 2 weeks before their mother's body gave out from grief, Trace had been a cattleman, a father, a husband. Now he was a man with no purpose, no voice, no light. Just a worn-out Bible in his saddlebag, and a silence so thick it pressed against his ribs every time he tried to breathe. The sound of quiet footsteps shifting in the grass behind him made him stiffen. He did not turn. Strangers pass through here sometimes, heading west toward Bozeman or north toward Helena. He expected the sound to pass by, but it did not. Then came the voice. "You are not alone anymore." It was soft, feminine, but steady, like someone who knew what those words meant. Trace turned, slow, uncertain. A woman stood a few feet away, her dress travel worn but neatly mended. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a braid and her hands were clasped in front of her. She looked to be about his age, maybe 28 or 30. Her eyes were a deep shade of green, sharp but kind. "I am sorry," she added, quieter now. "I do not mean to intrude. I was just passing through." He stared at her for a moment, unsure if she was real. She did not flinch under his gaze. "Do I know you?" he asked, voice hoarse from disuse. "No," she said, "but I know what that kind of sorrow looks like." He swallowed hard and looked back at the graves. "That you're wagging out on the trail," she nodded. "Horse through a shoe. I stopped to rest while I wait for the blacksmith in town." A pause. "My name is Violet Archer." Trace blinked. "Trace Bowman." She stepped closer, but not too close. "You lost your whole world, did you not?" He nodded once, jaw tight. 3 years ago I had a ranch, a wife, 2 kids, and more cattle than I could count. Now all I have is that marker and a broken fence line I do not care to fix." Violet stood silent for a while. Then she slowly lowered herself to the grass beside him, careful not to touch the headstone. "I buried my brother 6 months ago in Kansas," she said. "He was all I had left. Died in a barn fire trying to pull out a neighbor's son." Trace looked at her then. "You came west alone." "I came west because there is nothing for me back east but a half-burned house and a field gone cold." He nodded again, understanding thick in the air between them. They sat in silence for a long while before Violet spoke again. "I know what it feels like to sit beside the people you loved and feel like the world left you behind." Trace pressed his palm against Claire's name. "I do not know how to start over." "I do not think you start over," she said. "I think you carry what you can and walk forward anyway." The wind shifted again. Violet stood and brushed her skirt clean. "I am staying at a friend's homestead west of the creek, just for a few days. If you ever feel like walking forward, you will find me there." She turned and left without another word, her boots whispering through the grass. Trace sat there long after she was gone, staring at the spot where she had stood. His hand still rested against the stone. But for the first time in weeks, the silence around him did not feel so heavy. That night, he slept on the porch of the abandoned bunkhouse beside the barn. The wind rattled the shutters, but he slept without waking. The next morning, he saddled his horse. He did not know why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the way her voice had sounded when she said, "You are not alone anymore." Or maybe it was just because it had been so long since someone said something kind to him. Either way, he rode west. The creek was low, gliding over rounded stones, and the trail beyond it wound through tall grass and patches of golden wild rye. He spotted the homestead just past a ridge small, with a fenced garden and smoke rising from the chimney. He was not sure if she would be there. But when he rode up slow, Violet stepped out of the barn holding a basket of eggs. She smiled when she saw him. A real smile, not pity, not forced, just warm. "You found it." He dismounted and nodded. Did not feel right just sitting there. Violet walked toward him, basket still in her hands. "I am glad you came." Trace looked at her, really looked. At the way her hands were rough from work, the way her braid had come loose on one side, the way she stood like she was ready for anything. He had not felt anything in a long time, not since the fever took the kids. But standing in front of Violet, he felt something stir. He did not say much. He just followed her when she turned back toward the house. And as the door closed behind them, the wind outside grew quiet. The floorboards creaked beneath Trace's boots as he stepped into the cabin's quiet warmth. The space inside was modest but tended with care. A braided rug lay before the hearth, and a kettle hissed softly on the stove. Morning light filtered through muslin curtains, catching dust motes in its path. Violet set the basket on a narrow table and pulled a mug from the shelf above the wash basin. "I've got chicory and dry mint," she said. "It's not coffee, but it'll warm you." Trace gave a short nod, still near the door. His hat was in his hand again, fingers tracing the brim without thought. "You don't have to stay if it feels wrong," Violet added, pouring hot water into 2 tin cups. "I only meant it when I said you could find me here." He stepped forward slowly, accepting the cup with a brief glance. "I don't know what feels right anymore." He took a sip, then added, "But this don't feel wrong." She sat at the table and motioned to the other chair. He joined her, the warmth from the cup working its way into his hands. Violet glanced at him, not probing, just present. "What did you do before?" she asked. "Before everything changed." Ran cattle east of the Shields River, had a few hired hands, traded hides and horses come spring. He looked down at the steam rising from his drink. "I wasn't much for talking then either. You speak just fine now." He looked up. "I don't know how to be around folks anymore. I tried at first. After. Went into town, tried to talk like nothing happened. Folks looked at me like I was carved from pine." "Some folks don't know what to do with sorrow," she said. "They think if they look away fast enough, it won't catch them." Trace studied her. "You're not like that." "No," she said. "I've buried too much to pretend it can't touch me." A long pause settled between them, not uneasy, just quiet. The kind of silence that held room for breathing. "What about you?" Trace asked, his voice low. "What did you leave behind in Kansas?" Violet's fingers curled around her cup. "A schoolhouse I helped build. A borrowed mule. A promise to my brother that I'd make it to the mountains like we always talked about." She looked out the window, her face unreadable. "He was the one who believed in things. I just kept the book straight." Trace nodded once. "You still planning to keep going?" "I thought I might stay a while. There's a widow here lets me tend her goats in exchange for bread and a place to sleep. I don't know what comes after that. Maybe nothing has to come after right away." They finished their drinks in silence. Outside, a pair of meadowlarks chirped from the fence rail. Trace stood first, setting the cup gently on the table. "I ought to check the fence along the north slope," he said. "Storm last week knocked a few rails loose. Could use a second hand if you're still working for that widow." Violet met his eyes. "I've got steady hands and a sound back. I'll be by after mid-morning," he said, stepping toward the door. She stood too, following him just far enough to lean against the frame. "Trace," he turned, his hand on the latch. "You don't have to talk about them. Not unless you want to. But if you ever do, I'll listen." He didn't answer right away. Then he tipped his hat just slightly. "That might be the kindest thing anyone said to me in a long time." The door shut soft behind him. Violet watched his figure grow smaller across the ridge, his shoulders broad beneath a worn coat. The kettle hissed again on the stove, and she turned back to the quiet room. Later that morning, Trace rode the fence line alone. The rails were worse than he thought, wind split and leaning. He worked without hurry, hammering new stakes into ground that had gone dry from sun and sorrow. By early afternoon, he saw her walking across the rise, a coil of wire slung over her shoulder. She didn't wave. She just nodded once, then bent to lift the next post. He passed her a length of wire without a word, and side by side they worked the line, their shadows long across the grass. By the time the last post was set firm in the rocky soil, the sun had begun its slow descent behind the Absaroka range, casting long streaks of amber across the grasslands. Trace tied off the final length of wire while Violet steadied the post beside him, her hands smudged with dust and rust. Neither spoke for a while, their quiet rhythm having said what needed saying for most of the afternoon. Trace straightened his back, rolling his shoulder once before glancing toward her. "You swing a hammer like someone who's used one before." "I helped build a sod barn outside of Russell once," Violet replied, brushing her palms against her skirt. "The walls kept caving in till I figured out how to layer the cut right. Most men I knew couldn't get a barn to stand through a winter," he said. "I wasn't building it for men," she answered simply. "Just wanted the mule to stay dry." He gave a small sound that might have been a laugh, brief and low. They walked back to where the horses were tied, the hush between them no longer hollow. Trace untied the reins from a cedar limb, but didn't mount right away. Instead, he looked out across the slope where the land broke gently into the valley below. "You plan to stay long with the goats." Violet pulled her braid loose and began replaiting it, fingers working without thought. "Mrs. Harlan's been kind, but she's got a daughter coming from Butte. I'll need to find someplace else by frost." "There's an old bunkhouse on my land," he said, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Not much, but the roof holds and the stove pulls clean." She kept braiding. "You offering me a place to sleep or someone to talk to?" "Maybe both," he said. "Maybe just a roof, I don't know yet." Violet tied off the end of her braid. "I'd pay my keep." "I figured you would." They rode back slow, letting the horses pick their way along the ridge trail. The scent of pine deepened as dusk settled in and the air grew colder. A pair of mule deer stepped through the brush ahead and vanished just as quick. When they reached the edge of Trace's land, he dismounted and opened the gate while she led her mare through. "I'll bring my things in the morning," she said. "You can take the bunkhouse," he told her. "I sleep in the main house. You won't be bothered." "I didn't figure I would be," she said, meeting his eyes. They stood there a moment longer before she turned her horse toward the widow's place. Trace watched her go until she dipped out of sight beyond the ridge. Only then did he make his way up the path toward the house, the windows catching the last of the light. Inside, he lit the lamp and stood still a long while, listening to the wind shift through the cracks in the walls. He reached for the Bible on the shelf but didn't open it. Instead, he set it back down and went to the stove. The next morning, Violet arrived just after the sun rose above the trees, leading her mare with one hand and a small trunk balanced behind the saddle. She wore a calico blouse he hadn't seen before, faded but clean, and a kerchief tied at her neck. He opened the bunkhouse door for her without a word and stepped back so she could pass. She looked around once inside. "You weren't lying about the roof. I patched it last spring, held through hail and wind." She set the trunk down and turned to face him. "Any neighbor's likely to take issue with me being here. You're not the first woman to live alone out this way. Folks talk. Let 'em. I've never cared much for their talk. Neither have I." She nodded once, then reached into her basket and pulled out a small bundle of wrapped cloth. "I brought bread, still warm." He took it, surprised. "You didn't have to. You gave me a roof. I give you bread, seems fair." That night they ate by lantern light at the table in the main house. She brought her own plate, her own knife. The meal was quiet but not empty. Trace poured water from the kettle and passed it across. She handed him the last of the bread without being asked. Afterward, she stood and looked around. "You still have your wife's things?" He met her eyes. "Yes." "You want me to leave the room untouched?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, it's time." She didn't press, just nodded and stepped outside, giving him the space he hadn't known how to ask for. Trace crossed the house and opened the door he hadn't touched in nearly a year. The air inside was still, heavy with sun-faded memories. He stood in the doorway for a long while, then reached for the quilt folded at the foot of the bed. He carried it out into the lamplight and handed it to Violet. "Use it," he said. "She'd want someone to be warm." Violet ran her fingers across the stitching. "It's beautiful. She made it the spring before we married." She didn't say anything more, just nodded and held it close. As she stepped back into the dark, Trace stayed on the porch. The stars had come out, scattered and bright across the sky. The wind moved soft through the cottonwoods. He didn't feel healed, not yet. But for the first time in a long stretch of months, he felt the land beneath him again. Solid. Steady. And in the bunkhouse just beyond the barn, a woman who'd known her own kind of loss lay beneath his wife's quilt, her breath soft and even in the quiet. The first freeze came early that year. The creek glazed over in the night, and by morning the garden rose behind the barn lay stiff and silver beneath a sheet of frost. Trace stood on the porch in his coat, watching his breath rise in the quiet. He hadn't set foot in town since mid-August, and he didn't feel the need. What he needed to be near was already here. Violet came up the hill from the pens, her scarf pulled tight over her ears. "2 hens won't lay any more," she said as she reached the porch. "They'll eat through the feed and give nothing back. We'll butcher them tomorrow," Trace said. "You know how to wring a neck," she nodded, "and pluck feathers without wasting skin." She paused, brushing frost from her gloves. "That quilt's warmer than I thought. Claire stitched wool between the layers," he said. "Didn't like to be cold." "You've got a steady hand with repairs," she said. "The bunkhouse holds heat better than the widow's loft ever did." "I'd forgotten the way it felt to fix things," he said. They stood together a moment, the sky above them pale and clear. Then Violet stepped down from the porch, walking toward the woodshed. Trace followed without speaking. Inside, the smell of cut pine filled the narrow space. She lifted an axe from the wall and passed it to him. "You split." "I'll stack." The thud of wood striking the stump filled the air. Violet moved briskly, setting each split log with care along the wall. "Where'd you learn to cut wood like that?" Trace asked, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow. "Traveling with my brother," she said. "He taught me to do a man's work when there wasn't a man to do it." "He teach you to shoot too?" She reached for another log. "He taught me not to aim unless I meant it." Trace nodded, then split another piece. "You ever fire in anger?" "Once," she said. "Didn't feel better after." He glanced at her, but she didn't look away. "You?" she asked. "Twice," he said. "Both times ended with someone in the ground." The woodpile grew higher. By midday, the sun had melted the frost from the grass and steam rose from their sleeves. Violet straightened her back. "I saw a coyote last night near the lower pasture. They'll come up this time of year," he said, "looking for chickens or calves. I'll sit out with the rifle tonight," she offered. "You've done more than your share." Trace shook his head. "You shouldn't have to guard my land. You gave me shelter," she said. "That's worth keeping." He set down the axe and leaned against the wall. "Do you ever regret it, coming here?" She leaned beside him, close enough he could feel the warmth off her shoulder. "No. Even when the cold bites and the wind stings, I'd still rather be here than in a place full of ghosts." Trace didn't answer right away. Then, voice quiet, he said, "I used to think the wind was the loneliest sound in the world. And now," he looked at her, "now it just sounds like winter coming." A silence settled between them, the kind that didn't ask for words. Violet reached down and picked up a stray chip of wood, turning it over in her gloved fingers. "I couldn't save my brother," she said. "I tried. I got him out once, thought he was behind me. But the roof gave in." Trace didn't move. "You carry it quiet." "It doesn't feel quiet," she said. "It presses in some nights like it's trying to climb out of my chest." He looked at her, his voice low. "That's how I know you understand." Her hand brushed his as she set the chip back down. Just a touch, nothing more, but he felt it like heat in his ribs. That night they sat outside with the rifle between them, watching the moon rise cold and bright over the pasture. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The coyote didn't come, but still they stayed until the stars turned above them and the frost crept in around their boots. When they finally stepped inside, Trace poured water into the basin while Violet lit the lamp. The glow was soft, catching the edge of her profile as she pulled off her gloves. He handed her a towel. "Your hands'll crack if they stay cold." She took it, dried her fingers slow. "You always watch out for other people, Trace." He met her eyes. "I used to, then I stopped. Now I'm trying again." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "You're doing all right." They stood there, the lamp flickering between them. Neither moved toward the door. Trace looked at her face, the way her eyes held steady even when her voice trembled. "I don't know what this is yet," he said, "but I know it's not nothing." "It isn't," she said. He stepped closer, slow, giving her room, but she didn't step back. "I won't rush it," he said, "and I won't forget what came before. I wouldn't ask you to." And then, in the hush of that room, she reached up and touched his face, fingers light against the stubble along his jaw. He closed his eyes just for a breath. When he opened them, she was still there, still steady, still real. The wind outside moved soft against the shutters, but inside the warmth held. The snow came that December, steady and thick, burying the earth in silence. The fields disappeared under white. The fence posts wore soft caps, and the trees stood still as statues beneath their weight. Trace had taken to hitching the sleigh when they needed to cross the land, the horses steaming in the cold as their breath curled into the still air. Inside the house, the warmth held strong. Violet kept the stove stoked through the day, baking cornbread and boiling beans, her sleeves pushed up as she worked. Trace had built a second shelf in the kitchen to hold the jars. She'd begun filling dried apples, pickled carrots, and the last tomatoes before the frost took them. She'd taken root in his space without ever pushing. On a morning when the wind howled across the ridge and the windows hissed with cold, Trace found her sitting in the parlor with a needle between her fingers and a square of cloth across her lap. She didn't look up as he came in. "You're sewing," he said, brushing snow from his shoulders. "I'm making curtains," she replied. "The ones in the back room are more whole than fabric." He walked over and leaned against the doorframe. "That's not your room anymore." Her hand paused mid-stitch. "No, no," he said. "You haven't slept there in over a week." Violet set the cloth aside and met his gaze. I wasn't sure what to call it. Call it ours, he said. If you want to, I do. He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair. Then let's stop pretending we're waiting on something more certain than what we already know. Her fingers found his, rough and warm. You want to say it first. I love you, Violet, he said. I don't need time to figure that out. She smiled, quiet and full. Then I'll say it too. I love you, Trace. They married in the spring. No preacher, no crowd, just the two of them standing near the pasture fence with the cottonwoods greening behind them and the wind carrying the scent of thawed earth. Trace spoke his promise with eyes steady on hers, and Violet answered him with words she'd never offered another. He built a new table that summer, larger than they needed, but they filled it with meals and stories and the kind of silence that's shared, not suffered. Violet planted herbs in the back garden, and Trace carved a wooden bench for her beside the lilac bush that bloomed like it remembered joy. By autumn, the bunkhouse held tools and feed, and the house felt like it had been waiting for them both all along. Trace hung a new door on the room that had once been closed, and Violet filled it with quilts and books and small signs of life. They didn't speak often of the past, not because it hurt, but because it had settled. The grave still stood behind the old fence, and sometimes Violet would leave flowers there, quiet and respectful. Trace had stopped dreading the walk. He'd come to understand that love stayed, even when people didn't. One evening near the end of the harvest, Trace came in from the barn with straw on his shoulders and found Violet standing in the kitchen with a hand at her belly. "You all right?" he asked, setting down his gloves. She looked up, eyes bright. "I think we'll need that cradle you kept in the attic." His breath caught, then settled. He stepped to her, laid his hand over hers. "You sure?" She nodded. "I'm sure." Trace pulled her close, his lips pressed to her hair. "You've given me more than I ever hope to have again. You gave me a home," she whispered, "and a reason to stay." The seasons turned like always, but nothing felt the same. The land still bore the scars of what had come before, but now it also held their footsteps, their laughter, the careful rhythm of two people choosing each other every day. When the child came a girl with her father's quiet eyes and her mother's strong grip, they named her Clara, a name born of memory and hope braided together. Trace built her crib by hand. Violet lined it with the softest quilt she'd ever stitched. And in the evenings, when the fire crackled low and the baby slept between them, they would sit close, fingers intertwined, and listen to the wind move gently across the roof, no longer something to fear. They never left that land. Didn't need to. Together, they made it wide enough for love to return, and deep enough that nothing was lost to the cold again.